Finding Peace and Hope. Hey, welcome to another look into the life and message of Elisabeth Elliot. She called us to live to a higher standard each day.
She didn't want us to be satisfied with throwing a little empty religion into our lives as a shallow substitute to giving God our best.
As our series continues in the coming weeks, we'll hear from family, friends, and others.
They were all influenced by Elisabeth's life and message. It's good to have you with us today.
All right, we're going to wrap up a short series today, just 4 parts, as we think about a peaceful heart. We'll also be hearing from a listener named Jill. She joins us here at our time together and wanted to comment on how Elisabeth has made a difference in her life.
And next, we will be listening to an excerpt from the audiobook, The Liberty of Obedience.
That's right. We'll hear that a little bit later. Right now, let's get to part 3 of our 4-part series, A Peaceful Heart. All right, well, in this series, there are 4 basic topics: forgiveness, prayer, a peaceful heart, and an inextinguishable hope.
How would you define peace? And we'll be hearing the story of dear old Mrs. Kershaw.
This is your friend, Elisabeth Elliot, talking with you this time about a peaceful heart. In the last 2 days, we've been talking about some characteristics of a Christian. 4 things which should distinguish one who calls himself a follower of Jesus Christ from those who don't. And these 4 things are forgiveness, prayer, a peaceful heart, and an inextinguishable hope. And today, it's a peaceful heart. Now, I could spend a lot of time defining the word peace and trying to describe this to you theologically, and there is a great deal in the Bible about peace. But I thought that instead I would begin by telling you a story which I would hope will illustrate to you how to get a peaceful heart. It's a story about an old lady named Mrs. Kershaw. When I came home for Christmas vacation, I guess it was my junior or senior year in college, we had just eaten supper, and I went out into the kitchen, and there stood an old lady with her back to me. She was at the sink. She was wearing one of those tiny print cotton dresses, and she had quite a large hump on her back. And so I said, "Hello, you must be Mrs. Kershaw." She didn't turn around. My sister was standing there, and my sister said, "She's deaf." I said, "Can't she hear even if you shout?" And my sister shouted, "Not even if you shout." And Mrs. Kershaw didn't move a muscle. So I went over and touched her on the shoulder, and she turned around and gave me the most radiant smile. And she said in her strange voice, "Oh, so you're the daughter." She was from South Jersey, and we used to imitate her South Jersey accent, which, of course, we had some pretty good traces of ourselves living in South Jersey. But she was standing there washing the dishes, perfectly happy. She had pinned to her dress in the front a little microphone, which she would pick off of its holder and hold to your mouth so that you could then talk and she would be able to hear. Her smile of welcome was as warm, as genuine, as all-embracing as it could have possibly been in that wrinkled face which reminded me of a dried apple. Mrs. Kershaw was a widow. I don't remember how my mother found her, but my mother had always managed somehow to have some kind of a helper in the house. We had had quite a succession of various kinds of helpers, some of them good and some of them less than good. I remember one young woman who had grown up on a farm. I really don't think she'd ever done much in the kitchen. And one day my mother went out to shop, I guess, for the day and left instructions with this young woman whom I'll call Beth. And when she came back, Beth met her at the door with a great big smile, and she said, "Mrs. Howard, I have a surprise for you." Well, Mother had already had enough experiences with Beth so that her heart kind of sank when she said that. Beth led my mother up to her room, to her own room in the third floor, and my mother found that Beth had spent the day, instead of doing the list of things that my mother had left for her to do, painting the entire room chocolate brown, including the furniture. Well, Mrs. Kershaw was very different from dear Beth. She was a godsend to my mother. She lived in a big old house with very little furniture in it, not very far away from our house, so we used to go and pick her up in the morning. Somebody would go and pick her up, bring her to our house, and she would spend the day making applesauce, washing clothes, washing dishes, sitting and talking to my step-grandmother who lived with us. And I remember going over to get her myself a number of times during that Christmas vacation, and there was a sign on the door, "I am home. Please come in." And I would find that the door was unlocked. I would walk in and have to wander through the big old empty rooms until I found Mrs. Kershaw. Then she would immediately break into that radiant smile again. "Oh, here she is," she'd say. "I'm all ready." And she'd come out and get in the car and happily spend the day in our house. I remember that she would almost always talk about the weather to start with when she got into the car. If it was a beautiful day, she'd say, "Oh, isn't it a nice day today? It gives folks a chance to do what they want." And if it was a horrible day, she'd say, "Oh, I like this kind of a day. It gives folks a chance to do what they want." One night at supper time, we got into a discussion about names. And, of course, we always had to take the microphone from her dress and hold it to our mouths if we were going to include Mrs. Kershaw in the conversation. So that was quite impossible most of the time, unless there was something special that we wanted to say to her, because there were 8 of us at the table besides Mrs. Kershaw. And we were talking about names, and then my father reached for the microphone and explained to her that he had given his children Bible names. Well, she thought that was a wonderful idea, never had thought of it. And we knew that Mrs. Kershaw had only one child, a man by the name of Harrison. And 2 or 3 nights later, out of the blue, Mrs. Kershaw said, "Harrison isn't in the Bible. I looked it up." Bless her heart. She was hoping that maybe she could find a Harrison in the Bible, too. She did read her Bible a lot. And one night before my father had the family devotions, which we always had at the end of supper time, he reached for the microphone, as he always did during devotional time, and he said, "I'm going to read from the book of 1 Thessalonians. And Mrs. Kershaw looked around the table and she said, "Oh, that's a nice book." Well, of course, nobody answered her because we couldn't without reaching for the microphone, and furthermore, we were supposed to be quiet during family devotions. Well, I think she thought maybe she'd said something wrong, and so she said, "Well, I don't know whether it's any good or not, but I like it." Well, we laughed about that, and since then, whenever one of us says something, quotes a scripture verse or refers to a book of the Bible, somebody is bound to quote Mrs. Kershaw. "Well, that's a nice book. I like it. Don't know whether it's any good or not." Then one time, we got one of those pressure cans of whipped cream, those squirt cans. They had just come out. This must have been back in the late 40s or early 50s. And we had it on the table, and nobody knew exactly what to do with it. So Mrs. Kershaw said, "Give it to me. I'll show you what to do." So she gave it a good hard shake and pressed the button and laid whipped cream right up her arm to her shoulder and around on the table. Well, we died laughing, of course, and she got as big a laugh out of that as the rest of us. She used to talk about the man that lived across the street because she used to take care of him. He was in his 90s. She called him an old man. She herself was in her late 70s. The thing that impressed me about dear Mrs. Kershaw was her serenity and peace. I've never known anyone less hung up about things, less frantic and frustrated. And yet she had very little. A widow whose son paid very little attention to her, living alone in a big old empty house, stone deaf, but we saw in her the acceptance of the demands of her own life with simplicity and grace, a positive receiving of the givens of life. Words like hassle, frustration, hang up, and put down, I have no question but what those words would not occur to Mrs. Kershaw. She had lived in poverty and loneliness, but she never spoke of having been deprived of anything that mattered. She had no interest in herself whatsoever. We had to pry out of her stories of her past, her childhood. And she was glad to talk about living on the farm and what she had done. Her interests were very simple. But she talked about everybody else. She was interested in all of us. She prayed for all of us. She had nothing whatsoever to say about her own feelings. In a word, she lived for us. And she would sit quietly in the kitchen and pray for us when she had finished the tasks that Mother had given her to do. And Mother was very careful about not giving her more than she could handle. I think of Paul's words in 2 Corinthians 4. He said, "We are hard pressed on every side, but we are never hemmed in. We are bewildered, but never struck down. We are hunted, but we are never abandoned to our fate." Another translation says, "We are handicapped, but never frustrated." That was Mrs. Kershaw. "We know sorrow," Paul said, "and yet our joy is inextinguishable. We are penniless, yet in reality we have everything worth having." That was true of dear Mrs. Kershaw. The Apostle Paul shakes up our categories about the things which are worth having. Godliness with contentment is great gain. What is it that makes a peaceful heart? I believe it is acceptance of the givens of one's life and fixing your eyes upon the Lord. If you let the Lord's face shine on you, you might be surprised to find that your face shines too. One of the characteristics of a Christian is a peaceful heart.
That was A Peaceful Heart, Part 3. Just one more in our 4-part series, so we'll get to that in just a little bit. First, though, it's the Liberty of Obedience audiobook. We've been taking excerpts from it, and another one for us now. This is about a prayer letter from a missionary candidate. What was the missionary candidate thinking? What was the problem?
Well, she had started to question whether her faith was what it should be.
What sorrow, frustration, and sickening failure result from the attempt to do a job for which one was never fitted? If we allow ourselves to worship some hero and try to imitate him, we may be exaggerating our own importance. If we refuse to budge, on the other hand, because we belittle the gift God has given us, we are equally guilty. We are not making a sane estimate. I received another letter, very different from the first one I quoted. This was a prayer letter from a missionary candidate. She was not going to the mission field after all. After a second interview, I have faced and admitted that I lack the most vital qualification for the work among the Muslims, namely a vital, deep-seated, quiet assurance and confidence in Christ. My faith is rather superficial and untested. Therefore, I feel it best to withdraw my application. The Lord has exposed many hidden motives. My desire to go to the Muslim was motivated by personal ambition, coupled with a vague sense of guilt and condemnation if I did not become a foreign missionary. How thankful I am that God stopped me. That's the end of that letter. If each of us has a gift, we know that its source had to be God. James told us this. Every good endowment that we possess and every complete gift that we have received must come from above, from the Father of all lights. James 1:17. To receive a gift and then ignore its source is not only the most chilling ingratitude, it is sheer arrogance. We give ourselves, or perhaps our heritage or our education, which amounts to the same thing, the credit. If anything has been given to you, why boast of it as if it were something you had achieved yourself? 1 Corinthians 4:7. In the definitive chapter on spiritual gifts, 1 Corinthians 12, there is a notable repetition of the phrases of the Spirit, by the Spirit, and through the Spirit. Peter, too, reminds us that in whatever way a man serves the church, he should do it recognizing the fact that God gives him his ability, so that God may be glorified in everything through Jesus Christ. And the reference for that is 1 Peter 4:11. The gift's source and end is God. To ignore the one is to frustrate the other.
That was another excerpt. That was actually from Chapter 3 of the Liberty of Obedience audiobook. Well, we'll be hearing from Jill, one of our listeners, as she talks about the impact that Elisabeth had on her life. Let's go to the final part in our series on a peaceful heart, called an inextinguishable hope. It's kind of hard to say. We'll hear about joy, but then also something tragic. Have you noticed how sometimes those things come together?
And we'll be reminded, even when we don't have outward liberty, we learn more of true liberty in Jesus. Travel with us to Berlin.
Yes, and pie-throwing contests. This is part 4 of A Peaceful Heart.
In my last 3 talks, I've been mentioning 3 things which distinguish Christians, or certainly ought to distinguish Christians from the rest. And today I want to talk about the 4th. The first 3 were forgiveness, prayer, a peaceful heart, and the 4th, an inextinguishable hope. Sometimes things happen all together which don't seem in any way to fit together. Do you know what I mean? Something very joyful, something horrible, something happy and peaceful, something which frustrates you to death. And if you're sensitive and rather thoughtful, you hardly know what to do. You hardly know what sort of attitude to take. Maybe some of you have read Catherine Mansfield's short story called The Garden Party. It tells of children getting very excited because there's going to be a very fancy garden party at their house with a tent and an orchestra and chairs and lots of beautiful food. And it describes the voices and the tinkling spoons and the laughter and the smell of the crushed grass. And then word comes that a man has just been killed down near the gate, a servant man. And the children wonder how to respond. One of them in particular feels that it would be impossible to carry on with the garden party, and the rest of them laugh her to scorn. Well, we've all been in anomalous situations which we feel don't fit together at all. One day I received letters from 2 of my brothers, and the juxtaposition of the things that they described was almost intolerable. Tom's letter began with describing the annual fair and sale at the country day school that his children attended. He called it a huge bash, enormous fun, all the parents pitching in enthusiastically to sell hot dogs and manage games. There were balloons, pom-poms, and crepe paper all fluttering about, music playing, pie-eating contests, cream pie throwing contests. The teachers volunteered their faces as targets, raffles, etc. My job, he said, was to oversee the antique car ride. The car in question was a 3/4 size scale model of a 1903 car with a tiny gas engine that putted along at 6 miles an hour. The tots drove it with one of the fathers riding shotgun on the running board. His letter went on to tell about a very different experience. He had been to Children's Hospital in Boston to chauffeur a mother and her little boy who has acute leukemia. The child is having 1, radiation on the brain, 2, chemotherapy, and 3, some dreadful spinal injections in the bargain. The scene in the playroom where all the little children come with their mothers to wait for their medicine is too much. All these little, bald, gray, elfin phantoms peering out of brown-ringed eyes. One tiny girl with a cane. Little tots with stuffed frogs and teddy bears clutched under their arms. Bone-chilling screams coming from the room labeled Special Procedures. Parenthesis, read spinal taps and marrow scrapings, I guess. A whole room full of beds where they sit propped up while the lethal chemicals drip through plastic tubes into their veins. One teenage girl lying on her side in that room quietly, with tears dropping slowly across the bridge of her nose. One baby with just enough hair left for her mother to have arranged 2 pigtails exactly the thickness of twisted black sewing thread, about 3 inches long. In the same mail came a letter from another brother, my brother Dave. "'Twas the 18th of April in 75, he wrote. Yet 200 years later, I am sitting in a hotel almost in sight of the infamous Berlin Wall that represents the opposite of all that Paul Revere stood for. Yesterday, I crossed that wall into East Berlin, and from the time I entered, with stony guards carefully scrutinizing me and my passport until I came out, again under the cold eyes of sullen-faced guards, I never saw a smile from one official. By contrast, I spent lunch and all afternoon with a group of 6 joyful, hearty pastors and Christian leaders who hugged me, gave me strong handshakes, joked, prayed earnestly, spoke words of encouragement to me, yes, not vice versa, promised to pray for me, pronounced a benediction on me at our parting. One man said to me, "Everything is gray here, no color." That is both literally and symbolically true. Very little color on the streets, buildings still pockmarked with shells from street fighting at the end of World War II. Gray, sad faces. Another said, "You can only be a happy man in this country if you know Jesus. Here you are either a Christian or not a Christian. No middle ground. When we don't have outward liberty, we learn more of true liberty in Jesus." Now there was a man with an inextinguishable hope, a kind of hope that set him apart from those other gray, sad faces that Dave saw in the streets. But the scenes that were called up by these 2 letters, gaiety, anguish, and persecution, were impossible to put together. How are we as Christians to look at things of that nature? What is it that God wants of us? Are we to try not to think of him during pie throwing contests, for example? Are we to try not to see the anguish of those little children in the hospital? Shall we just try to forget the suffering behind the Iron Curtain? Can we put together in our imagination music, balloons, cream pies, brain tumors, barbed wire, and death? But this is the world we live in, isn't it? And we read that the light came into the world, and the light shines in darkness and is not conquered. All the darkness in the world can't put out the light of even one single candle. Christianity looks steadfastly at the facts of whatever kind, and looks also at the ultimate purpose, everlasting love. The Christian remembers the strength of those everlasting arms that are underneath. The Christian remembers that God's story is not finished yet. In Colossians, the 1st chapter, we find that word hope at least 3 times. In the 5th verse, Paul says, "Love and faith spring from the hope stored up for you in heaven, that hope of which you learned when the message of the true gospel first came to you." In verse 23, "You must continue in your faith, firm on your foundations, never to be dislodged from the hope offered in the gospel which you heard." And verse 26 and 27, the secret hidden for long ages, but now disclosed to God's people, to whom it was his will to make it known, to make known how rich and glorious it is among all nations. The secret is this: Christ in you, the hope of glory. I don't know what your situation may be today. Maybe you're going to a pie-throwing contest or a country fair. But maybe you have to go to the hospital with someone you love. Maybe you are in the hospital with those tubes running in and out of your body. Perhaps it's chemotherapy, cancer. Perhaps you're in a situation where everything looks gray and sad. I speak to you of a gospel which is meant to redeem the world. Jesus simply wants us to come to him. He says, "Come unto me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, or all you who are tired and overburdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me." This Christ loved us and gave himself for us. He wants to live in us, and he wants us to live our lives in him. That is the hope of glory. That's the only hope which is inextinguishable. Even when the loved person dies of cancer, and I know what that's like. My second husband died of cancer, and my prayers seem to have been unheard. Yet it is that hope that keeps me going. That hope was not extinguished, because I know that I am loved with an everlasting love. I know that what God does, he does out of love, and that the story is not finished. The day is going to come when we're going to see that our hope was not in vain.
An inextinguishable hope. Well, before we go, let's hear from Jill. Now, who's Jill?
Well, she's one of our listeners on this series, and she wanted to tell us how Elisabeth has had an impact on her life.
From Washington State. I first heard about Elisabeth Elliot through the Robert J. Morgan Ministries in his daily 1-minute sermons. And that information has changed my life so much. She speaks to me in a way that is for a woman. And as a woman who's been hurt, a woman who has had to learn how to persevere, a woman who has to pick up and keep going, a woman who has to just do the next thing, even when it's really tough. I just want to let you know how grateful and thankful I am for her messages, that you've made them available to us. I listen to her literally every morning before I go to work. And I can't even begin to describe the difference that she's made in my life. I do want to thank you so much for sharing her with us. I just wish I'd have known about her much, much, much sooner. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jill, for those thoughts. And remember, you can also let us know how Elisabeth has made a difference, her ministry in your life. Go to elisabetheLiot.org. Look for the top where it says resources. Then click on podcast, and you'll see where you can record your story. We'd be glad to hear from you. We'll also have information in our show notes about it. But again, elisabetheLiot.org, and then resources, and then podcast, and you'll see it there. It's probably best if you do it using your phone because it already has the built-in microphone. What else can they find if they go to elisabetheLiot.org?
You may access more lectures and talks, devotionals, videos, Gateway to Joy programs, and plenty more.
And until next time, may God remind you each day, you are loved with an everlasting love.
And underneath are the everlasting arms.